Welcome to the Restitute Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring some of the mythical or legendary accounts across the land. We're oftentimes informed that the Native Americans were simply a hunter-gatherer society, and yet there's so many more details and so many more dimensions to the accounts of the Native Americans that we're going to consider in this exploration. They seem to be tied a little bit more closely to the land, and there are many more different origin accounts and legends that they possess through their oral traditions. Now, granted, as we explore these oral traditions, we're going to keep in mind that many may not have been transmitted to us directly. I would prefer to actually have a Native American account these lost tales of the old world to us directly, and if there's a demand, we'll do that. But I think there's some wonderful details that we need to consider as we explore the lost tales of the old world. We begin by examining the account of the Seti Ka, or the Siti Ka, there's many ways to pronounce it, a legendary group of people encountered by the Northern Paiute tribe, or the Northern Paiute people, who existed in Nevada, northwest Nevada to be exact. I'm always intrigued when we look at these images, though, that are ostensibly taken from the 1800s, at least again that's what we're informed of. What do they really communicate to us, though, about these people that existed during that time? There seem to be many unique traditions that are associated, and yet how much of this actually reaches us to this day? There always seems to be some odd figure that's in the background that is watching over many of these images. And what's really going on with a lot of this background? How developed is this civilization that they actually took this picture in? It paints many different conflicting images and accounts that we have, and one of the reasons that the Seti Ka are intriguing. Yes, this is the Seti Ka. I've always wanted to say that. Giants. Red-headed giants, anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall. But there's conflicting accounts, and of course historians and scholars have looked at these oral traditions of the Northern Paiute people and have screened them, saying that, well, perhaps they merely encountered some people who were only taller, perhaps 6'9" or 6'10", but certainly not 8 to 10 feet tall. And yet there are numerous other accounts from Native American oral traditions that indicate the encounter with giants. Now, to be honest, in my travels, I've never come across the bones of giants anywhere, and yet I've also never come across the bones of dinosaurs, so does that mean they don't exist either? I don't know. I leave it up for you to decide. But it's a very compelling account imagining what these people may have been faced with, and if they did indeed encounter actual giants, 8 to 10 feet tall or perhaps much larger, what was exactly the nature of this encounter? And who were these giants? Who were these Seti Ka that they encountered? And what methods or techniques did they come from with their particular civilization? How great of a threat were they to the Northern Paiute people? What sort of theories could we come up with to try to explain the presence of these incredible giants? Were they simply natural denizens of the land at that time in what we think of as northwest Nevada? Northwest Nevada is very interesting in and of itself, as it has many unique anomalies with it, along with these accounts that we have from the Northern Paiute people. And indeed, we even have such accounts as places such as Pyramid Lake, named by the great explorer Charles Fremont, and Pyramid Lake named because it has pyramids in it. Is there truth behind these accounts of these giants that were encountered, and the threats that they may have posed to the Northern Paiute people? And indeed other giants encountered in the central highlands of Mexico, and by other Native American groups, capturing and putting to death a giant. And why would they possess such a great threat? Well, could they have been some sort of remnant warrior that was brought about in the previous civilization? Or were they some sort of specialized hunter that was created through what we might think of as alchemical processes to hunt and terrorize the survivors of the last reset? And indeed, that seems to give us the impression of what's truly going on with many of the Native American oral traditions, that they had a better connection with the land and the other creatures that inhabited the land. And indeed, that's something that we see that rings true with all the Native American peoples and tribes that still exist to this day. Although we have conflicting accounts because mainstream studies, scholars, they try to go back and say that none of these accounts could be completely accurate. Perhaps it's simply exaggeration. It is oral tradition after all, and oral tradition is very easy to discredit because oral tradition does admit that there are multiple accounts because it's transmitted by somebody talking to another person, and Perhaps there could be something added to the message or subtracted from the message over time. Yet we look at the Lovelock Cave where this incident occurred in Nevada, or Nevada if you're in Iowa. Many different ways to pronounce the same word, which is always rather enjoyable. But you consider this very climactic account in this final decisive confrontation between the Northern Paiute and the Seti Ka, or the Seti Ke. And we look at other images, which, of course, we're told were debunked, and indeed many scholars have looked at this cave and this encounter, and they have certainly put their efforts into debunking the very existence of these giants. Of course, we don't know exactly when this encounter occurred, given our current chronological calendar, but we do have some idea that there are fossils and remains in these caves, but of course seeing them and actually analyzing them doesn't really give us any more answers. Is it possible that the Northern Paiute encountered these giants? It's very possible. Now, could it also be possible that they simply encountered a wandering band of strange people who had red hair and were on the higher range of 6 feet tall? That's possible as well. But I believe that there's a little bit more of accuracy and validity to this particular account, because when you have oral tradition, it's climactic events, memorable events that tend to be remembered and transmitted on the oral tradition. And even with the variances in the different accounts that you have with the encounter of the Seti Ka, there's other tribes and other peoples across North America, and other lands as well, who've encountered giants. And yet it's always dismissed, it's always derided. Considering sacred sites across the land as well by various peoples and tribes and nations, it's also intriguing to me that we oftentimes look past Salton Lake, which is in Southern California. Salton Lake has many different accounts associated with it. Some even say that it could be a gateway, a portal to other lands, and others say that the Native Americans had many different accounts with it, stating that it could have been a path to darkness. Also, the origin accounts of these lands in Southern California are very intriguing, and whether we're talking about the Colorado Desert, the Mojave Desert, or the Sonoran Desert, or any of the other deserts in Southwest United States, there's always something interesting associated with them. This Salton Sea, or Salton Lake, or all the other names that it's had, always seems to have had an interesting history of development with it. Indeed, in the 20th century, or the 1900s, the United States and the state of California attempted to develop this area. And it did not succeed for a variety of reasons that you can look up on your own, because it seems as though, once again, there's even conflicting accounts as soon as just a few decades ago. For whatever reason, the area is now mostly uninhabited, and there's all kinds of accounts of strange encounters. We also look at some of the brilliant landmarks in the southwestern desert, and whether we're driving through Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, or any of the other areas within the four-state, four-corner area where the ancestral Puebloans inhabited, although how real are the ancestral Puebloans? Did they really exist as the mainstream tells us they did? Are they connected with the actual oral traditions of the Native American nations and tribes that inhabited the area? It's subject to much debate. And you'll even come across great craters, such as the Great Crater. But what really caused it? Is it really from some meteorite or asteroid impact, as we might be expected to believe? And even the mountains, the Tetons, as you go into Wyoming. Going all across the land, you have these very interesting landmarks that seem to give the clue that there's something much more dramatic that was going on in this western area of the United States. And many people and defenders of the mainstream narrative will simply try to tell us that the Native Americans are proof that there was no civilization that existed prior to our civilization. And yet the same mainstream will tell us that, well, actually the Native Americans did have great civilizations of their own, and some of them even built pyramids. It just depends on what latitude you're at, whether you call them pyramids or whether you call them mounds. Such as the interesting account behind Mount Rushmore, which we explored. Are we talking about kings? Are we talking about Vikings? Are we talking about 6 grandfathers? We've explored it in detail before, but one thing I always found intriguing about the Black Hills area of South Dakota where Mount Rushmore is situated is the fact that all Native Americans in that area consider it a very holy and respected place. And as they said in the film Dances of Wolves, even our enemies agree that this is a special place. And if you examine the terrain anywhere around the Black Hills, or what is today called Custer National Park, you'll see that. There's scenes of immense serene beauty that one could lose oneself in. And it's very easy to understand exactly how and why the people that we affiliate with the Native Americans, whether it's the Sioux or any one of the numerous tribes, do have a closer connection. And let's look at the account of the Hopi of the Fifth World. The Hopi, one of the descended tribes or nations from the ancestral Puebloans. What I find intriguing, though, about the accounts of the Hopi is some of the Puebloans or the Pueblo ruins that are still present in the southwest United States. And whether we're in southwest Colorado or anywhere else, you'll see that there's some very dramatic ruins there that give you the impression of settlements that were very well constructed and planned out. And oftentimes you'll have the remnants of infrastructure that we tend to associate with older civilizations. Could this have been some sort of reset compound of its own? A place where the people attempted to survive? The Hopi are perhaps most interesting in terms of their account of the reset because they do have an oral tradition that relates that we are currently in what they consider the Fourth World, or at least the Fourth Era to them. And yes, this is one of the accounts that actually inspired the concept of the Five Eras on this channel. And I think there's a lot of details that do reach us through the Hopi oral traditions. And it should be noted that one of the reasons why I personally hold such a high respect for Native American nations and tribes is because of the fact that they have retained this very close connection that they have. One, to their own personal history, the true account of what happened, but also their understanding of achieving a balance with the land, the resources provided by the land, the other creatures that dwelled upon the land. That's something that I think is always respectable. When you actually look into the artwork of the Hopi, though, you'll find some very interesting representations. Now, were these just a people who didn't have an understanding of their land? The oral traditions and what we see, it seems that they had a great understanding of what was really happening. And the fact that they do relate to us of what happened in the distant past, with worlds that fell out of balance, with peoples who indulged in evil practices. And this is what ultimately caused what they would consider a reset in what they term the previous worlds. Now, once again, I'm just giving a generalized summary of these oral traditions. I think the best way to really share these oral traditions would be to actually have a member of one of these nations or tribes relay them on a video. And if there's a demand for that, I may consider it. As it may be, I do have the means of actually having some individuals relay their oral traditions. Now, are there oral traditions that they will not share? Absolutely. And can we really be surprised that there are many things that they don't share with others? Not at all. Because in many of the mentalities, it's because of the fact that knowledge has to be earned. You simply can't bestow it on people. You simply can't share something and have it repeated. And we certainly see examples of that in our current society, in our current civilization. That we simply repeat an account that's given to us, we apply no critical thinking or thought to it, and suddenly it becomes the truth, and it becomes the incontrovertible truth. And yet when you look across the land and you consider these many different wondrous accounts that the Native American nations had, their oral traditions seem to reflect many dimensions that were once really present on the land. And indeed, I've always given a lot more veracity to what they've shared with the origin story, especially with how the land came to be. One area that's always intrigued me is the Mojave Desert, and especially the area around what we call Death Valley to this day. How exactly was the land scarred in the way that it was? What's the true account of what really happened? Was there some sort of comet or meteorite that actually hit the area and destroyed the land? And what about the ant people? Yes, the ant people who helped the Hopi. It's even stated that they saved them twice from destruction, taking them to the underground, in great underground cities. And once again, we have another account of a more advanced people with greater cities. And who were these ant people? There's many different theories. Some state that they were extraterrestrials. Others state that they're simply more advanced civilizations that live in the crust of the very earth itself, or whatever you want to think of it as. There's many conflicting views in who and what the ant people could have been. But the fact that there's this spiritual resonance that you see that still endures with these oral traditions today, and the simple fact that they're still remembered and recounted. We can see how the Hopi were dispersed across the current state of Arizona, and where their reservations were. The reservations, a definite sign that the Native Americans endured a reset that was imposed by another power. That was just simply the way that they endured it. And then, of course, the American education system, which is all part of the conflict assimilation indoctrination concept or process that seemed to be used on everyone across the land after the last reset. And yet, for whatever reason, the Native Americans, whether it's the Hopi, the Navajo, the Lakota, or any of the other tribes or nations, managed to retain their connections with their past. And they've also managed to retain a very deep connection with the land. And that's one of the main reasons why I believe that they have a more accurate account of what may have transpired in the past. Now, are there other details that we still may be searching out? Are there other dramatic examples of what could have happened? Absolutely. But again, you simply can't repeat something. You simply can't share something. Knowledge has to be struggled for in many ways, shapes, and forms. And it takes experience. For example, looking at this incredible area. The Anasazi Ruin in Mesa Verde, southwestern Colorado. A very impressive city that seems to have been built in the very rock itself. Many intriguing realities exist, though, about these particular sites in terms of how they're actually hidden within the land, and they even seem to be hidden from aerial observation. Quite an interesting consideration if we're to take the past chronology that we're given from the mainstream at face value. Many of these wondrous terrain features, though, that these cities were hidden in still exist to this day, and we have to reevaluate exactly what we see in terms of the Native Americans. These weren't just a hunter-gatherer culture that simply roved the land as nomads. These were people that were very much in touch with their society, their culture, and their land. And the fact that they built incredible cities like this within the land itself. And we have to also evaluate what it means that they seem to have been concealed from aerial observation, because that's one of the realities that's often faced. It's an observation that's called out with many of these older settlements that still endure to this day. How exactly did they build them, and what resources did they really have? And when we look at the ruins of these cities and amazed at how well they're holding out, we also consider how we might think of this area as being very underpopulated currently. But was that always the case? And indeed, what actual details occurred within this particular land, these four corners of these states: Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and then even going beyond the four states to the west to Nevada. It's very intriguing when we consider these accounts and this impressive land. We consider the fact that these wondrous cities were once built by these people, seemingly hidden by aerial observation. Was there some sort of threat that could have come from the air? It's one of the things that when you look at how a city could have defended itself, we oftentimes look at the cities in Europe, and we've talked about the Great Star Fort fortifications, at least that's what we're informed about them, and indeed they even came across the United States during the United States Civil War. But these fortifications were not very effective. We consider the Cliff Palace and how it was actually constructed in Mesa Verde, and yet we see signs of similar construction. We see an industrious people who were creative and managed to actually build a very geometrically impressive city and yet also conceal it within the very land itself. And whatever the adversary or threat that they were facing at that time, it was quite ingenious. And if you have the means and you're anywhere near Mesa Verde, Colorado, I certainly recommend visiting these sites because there's nothing like an on-site exploration. The very impressive and geometrically precise Pueblo Bonito, laid out in northern Mexico, or northern New Mexico, by the ancestral Puebloans, as they are called. Again, what's the true history behind these peoples, and how exactly do they relate to the current nations and tribes? Do their oral traditions actually indicate that these great civilizations existed, or do they have a different account of them? That's something I certainly encourage you all to research and come to your own conclusions on, because it's very difficult to determine. And also remember the fact that if you go to further latitudes in the south, you'll come across actual pyramids. Mexico is really not that far away from New Mexico, and it's really not that far away from the United States, where we'll be assured that there were no pyramids built by the civilizations at that time. But whether we're talking about the Aztec, the Mayan, or the Incan, we always have signs that there may have been much more that was occurring in the past. When we look at northern New Mexico, we see one of the most dramatic remains of an area called Shiprock. Shiprock with a very unique rock formation that, oddly enough, seems to have walls coming off from it, going in multiple directions. Of course, the mainstream tells us that this is merely the result of volcanic activity and a series of natural geological activity over the years, and yet the Navajo have quite the interesting origin story. And now let's go to St. Louis to look at the Mississippian culture. Yes, there were actual mounds in the city of St. Louis, although some people have tried to tell me that there were only mounds in Cahokia across the river in Illinois. But these mounds did actually exist in the city of St. Louis, and the mainstream and the official history of the city indicates that these mounds were removed. And these actual mounds that you could say resemble certain structures, we've been over it many times, were removed because they needed to make way for building the city of St. Louis. So once again, we have another account of a massive excavation project that had to be undertaken during a time when there was limited to virtually no heavy machinery, and yet once again working very, very hard and diligently and having plenty of time to pose for pictures. The people of St. Louis in the 1800s had the time to remove these mounds. Indeed, there was supposedly an ironclad, and yes, I'm going to use that term directly, in the United States Civil War, named the USS Mound City after this area of mounds. Unfortunately, somebody had the foresight to take pictures of these mounds before they were removed from St. Louis. Even an account saying that the mounds were removed to facilitate having the World's Fair. And now we're actually looking at the mound in Cahokia in Illinois, just to make it very clear for some people who try to claim that there were mounds that were only in Cahokia. Yes, this is the Great Mound in Cahokia. What was this really, though? Is this the remnant of something much more dramatic and a sign of something beyond natural terrain? Well, even the mainstream tells us that this is not just a hill, this is actually a mound, and that this was artificially constructed. But what's the truth of the reality behind this particular picture? What in fact is the truth behind these Mississippian cultures, as they called them? Now, these were ancient Native Americans, as they like to say, that lived in this particular area of the United States centered around the Mississippi, although they seemed to spread out quite a bit, didn't they? And you might recall in the distant past of the channel, we did explore a site called Aztalan in Wisconsin. We'll take a look at that again because that is connected with these Mississippian cultures. And something else I'll ask you to consider is, do the oral traditions of the current Native Americans actually reflect the reality of these Mississippian cultures? Or is this merely a mainstream interpretation from the current universities and scholars of the United States? And yes, I'm well aware that there are many Native Americans who have taken part in these studies, and I'm not saying or questioning their legitimacy. I'm merely saying that we need to apply critical thinking and ensure that what we're looking at is the actual account. Because what's intriguing to me about this Mississippian culture is just how advanced it's shown as being in a lot of this artwork. But how accurate is it? In other words, could it have been much more advanced? Could they have actually been the very cities that are still sitting there? Or is there some other explanation? Could it also be that what they're really referring to are the remnants of the civilization from the Third Era, before the reset to the Fourth Era? Or could it have simply been the surviving enclaves from the Fourth Era to our current era? Again, we're referring to the channel's 5 eras theory. But you can see how it ties wonderfully into the other accounts, oral traditions, that came from any number of Native American nations or tribes. Indeed, we look at how the Spanish explored the United States, according to the mainstream account, and what they may have come across. And oftentimes what we're told is that the early explorers gave us the details of these Mississippian cultured peoples, or whatever you want to call them, because they seem to have different names. Oddly enough, whatever group of people we're talking about, they left wondrous artwork and many different examples. We're also informed by those original European explorers, again, according to the mainstream, that these cultures were actually into human sacrifice, much like the Aztecs. And the reason were stated is that because they believed they were living in the final era, and the only thing that was going to keep the last sun from dying out was by engaging in human sacrifice. Although, how much truth is there to this account? And remember who this account came from, because we might want to recall that according to the mainstream history, the Spanish did impose this little economic system called encomienda. Encomienda, which was not exactly kind to the survival of many of the individuals from the civilizations that once flourished in these lands. Now, is this exactly what happened? Well, it's what the mainstream tells us. Or are there more details behind it? Is there something else occurring that we may not be aware of? Is there a reason that there is such an effort made to convince us that this Mississippian culture existed the way that it did? Is it simply trying to direct our focus somewhere else? There's no doubt that there's many mounds across the land, and no doubt that they seem to reflect a great understanding of engineering and geometric precision, and they certainly took a lot of work to achieve. And of course, we're not going to call them pyramids because they're not pyramids, they are mounds. But yet, whenever you look at the examples of the artwork and you understand exactly what it really reflects, you have to ask, is this something that this actual people did? Or were these merely remnants and artifacts that were found later that were attributed to a different group of people? How could anybody or everybody get it exactly right, is all I'm asking. Because it's amazing to me how confident we are and how oftentimes we like to hand wave, categorize, and label many groups of people. And we still do that to this day. And it certainly doesn't have to be an ancient people or civilization that we're not aware of. But yet we seem to have this perception that this great culture, this great civilization was capable of achieving these mounds, and they had a great understanding of the land. And yet they always want to tell us that they seem to have a darker side, while at the same time ignoring our own darker side. Going back to the Aztalan site in Wisconsin, near Lake Mills in Wisconsin, just south of I-94 between Madison and Milwaukee, I'm reminded of those sites that I saw there. And over a year ago, I walked them and actually explored them. And if you have any sort of site with mounds like this anywhere close to where you may be located in the land, I strongly suggest walking it and looking at it on site. The reason I started with Google Earth, and this was actually one of the original explorations that turned me away from using Google Earth, because there were a lot of details that you just don't see. But when you actually get on the ground, you'll see what a mound looks like and what a pyramid actually looks like. And remember that we define certain things as mounds, especially anything in the United States, and the only pyramids in North America are to be found in what is today Mexico. Is there something more to this account, or once again, is it just a hand-wave explanation? Are we being intentionally confused, or is the mainstream not fully understanding exactly what happened in the past? Is there something that's attempting to be hidden, or is it just simply confusion and misunderstanding? Not necessarily any sort of purposeful intention to mislead, but simply not being aware of what actually happened. I'm always amazed when you just consider that, when you compare any mound to any of the bona fide pyramids that we have down in Mexico. And oftentimes when we talk about pyramids, it tends to set off a lot of different things. For example, we sometimes seem to have issues when we want to talk about certain areas with pyramids. For example, in Sudan, nobody ever talks about the pyramids there, but there are many pyramids in Sudan. They're very beautiful. Going back to the Aztalan Mound, it's not a pyramid, it just looks like one. It just has steps and levels to it, and somebody put a lot of effort into building it. But it was looking at images like these and then looking at Google Earth that convinced me that I needed to get on the ground out there. I really needed to take a closer look because I realized that what we were actually seeing might not be reflected even in these images and on Google Earth. And I know I was making quite an issue at that point, and one of the reasons I share this is just to recollect and understand how we've come as explorers over this time, how our perceptions have changed, and really understanding what this is. What are these mounds in reality? Are they the remnants of structures from a distant civilization in the past? Or are they simply the remains of structures that the last civilization or the fourth era attempted to construct to survive the oncoming reset? The interesting thing when you look at the oral traditions of many of the Native Americans is that they seem to be well aware of events that were coming and were prepared for them accordingly. Now, is there something more behind that? Did they have some awareness through some means we didn't understand? Did their actual existence give them a prescient capability? Or did somebody come along and warn them? Well, it depends on which accounts you actually look at. Indeed, it seems as though these ant people who assisted the Hopi in their survival seem to have an awareness and understanding of what was happening. Why is it we see so many examples of observatories over time that are all across the land? Indeed, there were so many observatories that were informed or constructed during the 1800s. Was there something that they were really watching for in what we think of as the sky? And of course, we have our different divergences in terms of what the sky really is. But why was there such a focus on that? Could it possibly be related to the awareness that whoever these ant people really were had, that they were able to use to assist the Hopi? Did they assist others? And could there have been a darker side to this account? Was it really a benevolent, altruistic assistance that these ant people lended to the Hopi? Or did they have more malicious intentions in mind? The Hopi oral tradition seems to record that they were a benevolent people. But again, we always have to look at multiple different sides to everything and not discount anything. The Aztalan site interested me, though, in Wisconsin because looking at these old images, it did seem to convey that it was a step pyramid. And looking at some of the original sketches of the ground, it once again seemed to match many of the other things that we had seen over time. And now, doing well over a year of explorations, we can see that the map of the Aztalan ground shows many great structures and a very impressive layout. But why is it that we always have this mentality that this had to be a certain way? And how could anybody who lived hundreds of years after this all transpired know exactly what things were like in these particular societies, these towns, these mounds? What was really the intention behind them? In fact, when you actually go and you walk the grounds and you look at some of the historical markers there, they'll inform you that it was the early European stories or the early European explorers who regaled their stories behind what these people were like. Actually, being on site, I remember being impressed at how everything was laid out. But I also noticed that there seemed to be an intention to communicate to us about what was really going on, as though we were supposed to have a particular perception. Because you might notice they put the palisades everywhere, and did those actually exist? Why would anybody bother with those? That almost looks like something that gives you a little bit of a distant past, or maybe some perception that's not actually correct with what the people at that time used. And again, what are we really walking on here? These are the kind of things that we need to consider. Because when you look dead ahead at the mound, you can see that there's a lot of geometric precision to it. You can't simply try to hand wave it away and say it's a natural formation, although at this point in time I wouldn't be surprised if someone tried to do that. When you're actually on the grounds, you'll come across these little historical markers that'll tell you the appearance and manner of dress, and they do say it was from European explorers' descriptions. And then they even give you an idea of the social organization. And once again, I'm just asking this question. Are these accounts actually from the Native American oral traditions? Or are they from subsequent scholarly and university-funded studies? It's just a question. I was always amazed, though, that when you look back at this particular mound, you definitely get that impression of many of those step pyramids that we see at the further southern latitudes in North America. And why is that? Is it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or do you see a completely different structure when you look in this particular direction? Do you get an idea that you really could be standing on something that was once immense and amazing? That even with the passage of time and even with the growth over it of the grass and the trees and everything else, you can get the idea that there is something beneath our feet that is very dramatic, and something that we have many clues, many different accounts from the Native Americans' oral traditions that might tell us what was really happening. That might give us a better idea in terms of our true account of what actually happened. Now, as I always say, the mainstream could be correct, but with every exploration that I do, I find it less and less likely. But again, that's just me. I, of course, leave it to you to come to your own conclusions. Maybe you think that our chronology transpired to our current calendar exactly as we're informed. Maybe there's no signs of intervention here on this site. Perhaps this is what it was really like. But walking along the site and really seeing it and really connecting with it personally, I still think to this day that it doesn't match what we're told. Although there was one use that I had for Google Earth, and that was actually off the official site, there was a much greater mound between it and the town of Lake Mills in Wisconsin. And I really have to ask what exactly was going on at that greater mound. Is that really a piece of terrain that really looks like a mound from the ground? I decided to drive past it and look at it and notice that it did give an impression of a very large mound. Or could it have been some other structure? Well, we'll just classify it as just another monadnock. But what are your thoughts on all this? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Great deserts of the land, found everywhere at different latitudes. A unique environment. But is it possible there was a unique life form in this unique environment at one point in time? When we explore it, we see unique structures, and perhaps they're just simply natural structures that have artificially looking features to them. Yet if you go around the desert enough, you can be excused for understanding that there may have been a very different form of life there. Our official mainstream and scientific accounts tell us that evolution is the explanation for different life. But what if there's an entirely different account, a oral tradition that relates a different sort of cycle that we've looked at? In this exploration, we're going to examine the account of the Hopi, their 5 ages, and most specifically, the very unique account of the saviors of their particular culture, their society, the ant people. We have found many examples that indicate that there was some sort of hive civilization that may have existed. Now, whether this civilization was subterranean or existed on the surface, and the details that we still find in the Hopi culture that may refer to it, the very dramatic landscapes of the desert that give rise to the possibility of different civilizations and a very different form of life, a completely different account of our origins and what we may have endured in the past. Come join me as we explore the account of the legend of the ant people. The Hopi, a Native American tribe, at least according to our official definitions. I'm always interested by the fact that we have this tendency of broadly categorizing peoples in this day and age. For example, we refer to Native Americans or indigenous people as the original inhabitants of all of North America, and depending what nation you're in, you'll have different broad categorizations. And yet each of these peoples represent unique tribes, unique nations with different societies and unique customs. The Hopi are one of many. And yet one of their main accounts of having 5 ages or 5 eras has no doubt inspired the theory of 5 eras on this channel. I wanted to look at the Hopi tradition and their oral traditions of the concept of the ant people. This legacy of, in the past, their entire civilization being destroyed, one time by fire and another time by ice. And the ant people were a group of people who helped the Hopi survive both of these horrific calamities, at least according to the oral tradition. Now, I am not going to try to relay the exact details of the Hopi oral tradition, because I did not grow up in that society. But we are going to look at it objectively and try to find a way in which it fits into the concept of our 5 eras, and even look at some different theories for what the ant people really were. The Hopi are very intriguing in the fact that within their cultural traditions, they do show different varieties that indicate something that is, well, just unbelievably amazing in terms of its variety and creativity, if we are to believe that these are simple cultural traditions that were not inspired. And yet we have the feeling when we look at the images and we study these cultural traditions of the Hopi that they do seem to be quite, frankly, divinely inspired. That there really was a situation in which these people faced imminent destruction. And we look at the other remnants across the land, and the Hopi existed, officially, for thousands of years in northern Arizona. Now, it's possible that their people have been there for far longer. What I've always found intriguing about our official mainstream explanation for the people that came to North America crossing the land bridge in the Bering Strait is that they all did develop their unique languages and unique customs.
Now, I suppose on a long enough timeline, perhaps we could accept that explanation, but I always had an interesting difficulty with it, because oddly enough, it's the exact same story that we have over in Europe. We're to believe that Europeans are one large culture, one large group, and yet when we look between the lines, we find many differences. You can find no shortage of references and artwork that depict these ant people. Who were they and what were they? The official tradition of the Hopi simply says that they were a special race that resided in subterranean areas and that they provided aid to the Hopi to allow them to survive these calamities. Or perhaps as we compare it to our reset theories on the channel and looking at the previous 5 eras, that the ant people were benefactors of the Hopi. Were they divine benefactors, or were they a special and unique race of beings that happened to be existing in either different parts of the land or perhaps even different areas of land that are difficult to access? And that for whatever reason they provided aid to the Hopi to allow them to survive these terrifying calamities. The details that we find within these legends are very compelling and very intriguing. There's also the fact that there is the ongoing presence of the ant people that is practiced and still remembered to this day, from both the Hopi and then their oral traditions going beyond their own society. The really interesting thing is that when you look at the Southwest Desert in the United States, you do get that impression that the land has been subjected to terrifying forces in the past. Now, once again, mainstream science has explanations for why we have different environments, different climate zones in different areas of land, and that there's unique weather factors that may have contributed to this. And these may all be true, and yet when you see some of the dramatic and unique existences that still linger in the desert to this day, the Southwest Desert in the United States is very intriguing. The fact that it is such an arid and yet almost lifeless environment from some perspectives, and yet life very much did flourish. There's even the signs that there are other sorts of life that still continue to flourish and may have once prospered in the desert in the past. We always think of that example of the burro or the donkey, the creature that was brought in by miners during the 1800s and was simply left to die, and yet left to its own devices, the donkey or the burro flourished. So is it a similar tale then with the Hopi or other peoples that may have just simply been left on the land? Or trying to figure out exactly what the origin and the true identity of these ant people really are? Was there some grander plan? Why is it that we have all these different legacies and legends that still endure to this day? It's not just with the Hopi, though. Many different cultures and many societies have these traditions, these myths, these legends about how they came to be. And yet it's interesting to think that there are a lot of overlapping themes within them. There's the concept of some being, whether it's divine or otherwise, having a greater capability, and utilizing that greater capability to help the people that still exist to this day that needed to survive these calamities in the past. And I would argue that this is some of the evidence that we have that these calamities did indeed occur. It was not a one-time event, but there's evidence that these terrifying reset events occurred on multiple occasions. And the legacy of the Hopi and their oral tradition of fire and ice. At one point in time, the land was beset with fire, and another point in time, it was beset with ice. They even tell us that the reason that ants are so thin is because the ants actually provided their own sustenance to sustain the people. Now, that's a very benevolent perception of these ant people. But what were they really? And why is it that we have the Hopi who show this divine adherence to remembering what the ant people really provided them? I've always been amazed by the Kachina dolls itself. The Kachina dolls themselves that seem to represent something that goes beyond a divine or even a more advanced being. It's almost as though it seems to be an amalgamation of a spiritual and yet a more advanced technological sophistication that was once possessed by these beings that of course we would think of as gods or other divine beings. But what were they really? And there's always that hard question of, were these saviors or were these tormentors? Because if this was some sort of separate species or separate race, referring to the ant people, what was their true intention? Did they only want to help the Hopi? Or were there other groups of human beings that had to go through these reset periods? Were they simply left to their own devices and ultimately left to die? Or were they abandoned, much in the same way that the donkey was officially abandoned in the Southwest American desert during the mining activities? What do these Kachina dolls really represent, though, on a deeper level? Is it just simply a spiritual reference, or are they really showing the technological capacity that these beings really had? There's other strange rumors that endure to this day of what's really happening in the Southwest desert. Now, it may simply be the fact that this is a very extreme environment. You have very low moisture in the desert, and certain areas of the high desert, such as the Mojave, which is adjacent to northern Arizona, you see rather unique environmental effects that occur. Was the land always this way, or is it simply the lingering effects of terrific forces that the lands were subjected to in the past? And that's why we have these legacies and these legends that endure to this day. I'm also fascinated by the fact that, once again, we have people that did not witness these events and did not participate in them, claiming that they know better in terms of what happened, as opposed to the people who actually have an oral tradition. There's a very intriguing connection, and it goes beyond a surface connection when you compare the origin accounts of both the Hopi and the Sumerians and the subsequent Babylonians. The concept of how the sky god actually compares from Babylonian and Sumerian myth to the concept of the ant people. Is it possible that these are actually referring to the same beings? Were they really deities, or were they actually some sort of advanced culture? And perhaps an even more disturbing consideration, that these cultures could have been species that actually survived previous resets, and they had greater knowledge. We even see areas in the terrain, such as Cappadocia, Turkey, which we've explored in detail, where it appears as though a civilization or structures have been built on top of the remnants of previous structures. Now, once again, our mainstream science assures us that this is all natural terrain that just happens to have the appearance of artificial structures that have structures built on top of it, and because of the unique conditions provided by the climate, that these natural structures were malleable and could easily be formed into modern houses, dwellings, and cathedrals, and even, of course, our favorite castles. That's the official explanation we get for Cappadocia. But could you look at it from another perspective? Do you see something different when you look at this? Does this resemble some sort of hive-like environment? A physical hive-like environment? Perhaps some sort of subterranean civilization that had lived and existed underground, that eventually made its way back to the surface over a long enough period of time. Why were they down there for so long? Did they have to survive the terrible calamity of fire from the sky, or an ice environment? Even the various cultural representations of the Hopi seem to refer to this pattern, and you'll see this representation of these ant people appearing in many different places. It's almost more prevalent than you tend to see certain icons in other religions, and that's something else I've found rather fascinating. And it would be very interesting to listen to the full oral traditions that we have. And of course there are nuances, there are varieties of these oral traditions. One thing I consider, though, is it possible that these ant people were not just the benign benefactors that we have an account of? Could it also be possible that they were operating with a completely different form of intent? Were human beings, or the human beings that we know to this day, the natural human beings, or have they been altered over time? Or could they be referencing the offshoots of these original species? It's hard to say. Looking at some of the diagrams that we have, though, of extensive underground caverns and maps and existences that we know to be real, then we have to ask these hard questions, that if there was a subterranean civilization, and indeed there are many indications that there was, and there's still evidence that there were subterranean civilizations, then how were these subterranean constructions achieved? Once again, we'll be informed that it's because we had a lot of will and just time on our hands in the distant past, and we were willing to take the painstaking effort to carve out these vast caverns, these incredible labyrinths that are subterranean. But does that really make sense? Would one actually go to all this effort, even if the soil or the material that they were carving through was more prone to being carved through. It still takes a lot of effort. And effort during a time when we're informed that there were logistical limitations. Of course, logistical limitations are never taken into account, it seems, when we're considering some of these mainstream accounts that we have of the past. But I look at some of these representations of these divine beings, and the other question that comes into my mind is, if they're not necessarily representing divine beings, then what are they representing? Could these ant people and these other references and terms that we have for these divine beings, and it seems as though every society and culture, whether it's an ancient civilization or even the more modern civilizations, have different references to these divine beings. They seem to represent perhaps an heightened technological capability. Perhaps they did have greater technology that may have seemed divine to those that existed at the time and actually kept the record of what really happened. What truly transpired during the time of these great calamities or these catastrophes, these accounts that we have of floods or fire from the sky, or even the land being covered in ice? And that's where I've always found a lot of interest, because if you step far enough back, you do actually find a lot more overlap within both the mainstream perspective of what happened in the past and even the alternative research perspective of what happened in the past. You can actually find connections between references of glaciers going over the land and, of course, this concept of the land being frozen at particular points in time. But you have to ask, is that where we lost the detail? Or do we still have the detail? It's just been mixed and confused in a series of overlapping accounts, and therefore we can never get the idea of what truly transpired. I look at the representations that we have of Sumeria and Babylon, and it strikes me with all the similarities that we have, especially with societies and civilizations that existed in completely different parts of the land and were isolated from one another, at least officially. Yet these stories that we look at in these details, when we examine them in totality, seem to give us much more connection than we'd ever expect to find. When you see the numerous cave drawings or the incredible artwork and then even the costumes and the divine reference that the Hopi have for the ant people, you get the impression that perhaps there was something more to the existence of these beings, that there is this sort of detail that's captured and remembered to this day, and not just in the oral traditions, but also in the cultural traditions. And really think about this when we have people that are dressing up or showing reverence for other beings or other creatures. Think about the fact that while it may seem far-fetched in some extraordinary account, or of course we always want to refer to the alien concept that we have, and it's not to discredit that, but it's merely to look at things from an objective point of view. Possible that there were, and maybe still are somewhere, beings that look like this. And would this explain a lot of these strange encounters that we've had over time? Whether these are actual strange encounters that are referenced in official history, or are they simply anecdotes that have been taken too far with certain details ascribed to them? You can go to this day and still explore all these vast subterranean compounds, whether you go to Turkey and many other areas across the land, where you can find extensive cave systems that you wouldn't expect to find them. I'll reference one example in the United States, Kentucky, where they have incredibly large cave systems that many happen to be overlooked, of course, aside from the main tourist areas that we have, which seem to be the areas that we're supposed to pay attention to. But when we're paying attention to those areas, we often forget how all-encompassing, how omnipresent these subterranean systems really are. And it does lend credence to the original theory or the oral tradition that there was the existence of a civilization that was underground. Now the question endures, was this just simply our predecessors? Or were our predecessors simply allowed to survive in these areas? Or, from a more negative perspective, were they taken down there to be altered, to be changed, and perhaps even to be experimented on in ways that defy our imagination? Because while you have more advanced technology, and we discussed in our explorations this past week, technology is a two-edged sword. It can be used for good purposes, it can be used for evil purposes, and it can be used for everything in between. The ambiguity of having these incredible cave and subterranean systems that exist to this day being an example. Now, perhaps you're more comfortable believing that it was merely a group of our predecessors who simply had a lot of time on their hands or were seeking to survive whatever terrifying empire was hunting them down, and rather than flee to more easy areas to hide in, they decided to carve themselves caves in areas because they had no other options. And that may be possible, but there are so many details behind that account that I always found unlikely. I'm also interested in the fact that these 5 ages that the Hopi really seem to understand and be aware of do show an equivalence that we find in other societies and other traditions. These cultures showing these divine beings or other forms of life. And that's the next question that we have to ask. Are these ant people, are these Anunnaki, are these Tuatha Danann, and all the different names that we have for these divine beings, are they really in fact divine beings? Or are they other forms of life? Is it even possible that they're species that existed in earlier eras that did manage to find a way to survive the reset? Now, that begs the question, well, if there were other beings that survived the reset, other great civilizations, then where are they today? There may be an explanation in the fact that there are physical realms or physical capacities of existence that are beyond our ability to access. To this day, we still have a very large debate about what the exact shape of the land is, and once again, while we're assured that we know exactly what the shape of the land is, and we have a lot of evidence that is incontrovertible according to many, the fact remains is that it is still debated. There's also accounts that the shape of the land did change. Now, the shape of the land changing, is that a mainstream account? Yes, indeed it is. Because we do have the theory, or if you want to consider it a fact, depending on your perspective, the existence of all the continents being together as Pangea. And when you look at the unique details that we have captured of the Hopi engaging in their cultural traditions, we do see something rather extraordinary. Almost a completely different way of life that has somehow been preserved over time. Now, is this something that the Hopi had as their original traditions, or was this something that they learned from their divine benefactors? Were they chosen by the ant people to survive? Or was it just all simply part of a larger experiment? The ant people were not the divine benefactors. They were actually more of a malign, intented being that wanted to see what would happen if they aided certain groups of people and did not aid certain groups of people. We don't know for sure, and that's why we have to consider all accounts. And is it even possible that this idea of creatures or a species resembling ants might be far-fetched and may simply be an interpretation? That's also entirely possible as well. Is it possible that the ant people that are remembered by the Hopi were simply other human beings that were wearing some sort of form of an apparatus, or dare I say, an environmental suit, a spacesuit, and that's really what the Hopi remembered and that's what they captured in their tradition? That's possible as well. And you can find numerous examples of this if you go back and you watch an old TV series called Space 1999, and I'll reference an episode called The Mission of the Darians. You'll see that the Darians actually managed to cause people to believe that they were some sort of divine being simply by wearing an environmental suit. Because if you had people that had never seen these things before, then what would they make of them? And whether we're considering the Hopi traditions or the traditions and the myths that we have from Sumeria or Babylon or countless others, we do have to ask that question. Are they really representing divine beings? Or are they simply representing humans that had more advanced technological capabilities? And maybe what we might think of as more advanced humans. Of course, there's another disturbing question that we have to consider. Is it possible that in addition to having advanced technological capabilities, that these humans were advanced in other ways that we don't like to consider? Ways that we're told not to consider today, such as introspection, the, how shall we say, strengthening of their own spirit, the connection that they had between their physical and spiritual form. Now, many will argue that science has disproven this, and yet there are many areas that science doesn't have an answer for. They have theories, But we always have to define the difference between a theory and a fact. And when you look at the remnants of these incredible subterranean compounds, and we think of the subterranean compounds that we have, that we know, or at least believe, that our own civilization is constructed, there does seem to be this recurring mentality, this idea that the only way to survive catastrophic events, whether it was past, present, or future, is by constructing these subterranean compounds. What is the real origin of this elaborate and dramatic terrain that we see in the southwestern United States? Very, very prominently in areas that seem to be very controlled. And maybe there's a good reason why these areas are controlled. Maybe it is simply to preserve their natural aesthetic appearance and to make sure that it endures for future generations. There's no doubt that's what will be informed, but could there be other explanations behind it? Is this just natural terrain that we're looking at, and it was formed by natural forces over time? Or is there perhaps another explanation? The very formation of the land. I'm always interested too when you look at some of the adobe huts and the different constructions, and you see a wide variety of capability with the Hopi alone. Now keep in mind, when we consider the Hopi, we're only examining one tribe, one nation. There are many tribes, many nations, with many different traditions. Yet for some unknown reason, we have this overlapping within their origin. And yet even in different civilizations that were located across oceans, which shouldn't have had any sort of contact. And yet we seem to have different explanations that try to account for this discrepancy that we have. Why is it that we say that the Egyptians have presence all across the land if they were indeed confined to geographical areas? Or the Babylonians, or the Sumerians? All these accounts we have of these sea people who just showed up and caused an apocalypse, but we really don't know a lot about them. Well, we could say that we don't really know a lot about what transpired 150 years ago because we don't have any first-hand sources to consult with. We have a very well-documented recorded history, and we're very confident in that. Because in the United States especially, our history from the 1800s was recorded by journalists. And if we trust journalists and the historians that interpreted what the journalists recorded after the fact, then we know we have a very confident view of our history. But going back in the distant past, do we have that same confidence? Or are we really left to the devices of hypothesis and speculation? And of course, that's why people set out to deride those that engage in hypothesis and speculation, even though mainstream science says that evolution is a theory, although some will present it as a fact, and those words exactly were used. Now, ultimately, I'll leave it to you to decide what to believe, because that is supposed to be a freedom that you're entitled to wherever you are in the land, whatever your particular nation or your government is to this day. You're at least supposed to be able to decide what you really believe. But what did the Hopi really believe? Did they really believe that there were these creatures, these divine beings from their perspective that resembled ants? These divine beings that sustained them through difficult catastrophes on multiple occasions? Catastrophes that completely changed the land. The accounts say that these Hopi were taken to subterranean compounds, and there they were enabled to survive the catastrophes that were afflicting the land. They were also provided with sustenance. And then there's other accounts that these ant people went so far as to sacrifice to ensure that the Hopi survived. We're not really sure exactly what happened. And it could be that the ant people aren't any sort of different creature, that they were merely other types of human beings, or other human beings that had more advanced technological capabilities, and that the devices, the technology that they used, was the only appearance that the Hopi or their progenitors actually witnessed. And as a result of that, it worked its way into their oral tradition and their legends, and really what they have are human beings that were wearing environmental suits at all points in time when they witnessed them. And as a result of that, they perceived them as a completely different creature. And you will find numerous examples of that, whether you look in science fiction, fiction, or other sources that show that the concept of people's identity and their culture and what they witness and what they capture is very malleable. Look no further than all of the unique societal developments that occurred after World War II, with the sudden presence of Allied soldiers in isolated islands across the Pacific, and look at the cultural effects there. Now step far enough back and consider how these things could be perceived over a long period of time, with oral traditions being passed down. How long were these oral traditions passed down for? Are we talking periods of thousands of years? Or are we talking an even greater timeline? Or even more disturbingly, are we talking a much more shortened timeline? Because I think one of the difficulties that we have is just how quickly things can change. Just think about this. If you completely remove an entire generation, just one single generation, one 20-year period, one entire group of people that passes down all the knowledge, all the understanding to the next generation, then in a 20-year time frame, would it be possible to induce an entirely new societal identity, an entirely new culture on a people? How long would it really take? Because I believe we have numerous examples that that time frame is on a much shorter period than we'd like to believe. Now, whatever the actual existence of time is it simply the passage of the seasons? Does it have a real physical identity to it? That's something we can definitely debate. And there's even the argument that there are multiple overlapping timelines, or that time itself doesn't even exist. It's simply a perspective that we have, and that we share to try to achieve some sort of shared understanding. Now, other people say, well, we age, there's demonstrable signs of the passage of time, and while this may be true, there are other accounts that show that perhaps time's not as fixed as we like to think. Even going back to the legend of how Merlin aged in reverse, and he was able to foretell prophecy because he had already witnessed such events. Now, while these may seem like extreme accounts, these are all the details that we have to take into consideration when we're trying to understand the legacy of the ant people. The disturbing revelation of the fact that these may have been benign beings, but they also may have been tormentors. It's possible that we just don't know what their true intention was. Maybe they simply wanted to exist and survive by factoring in a civilization in the underground. There has to be some reason why that theme is still so strong with us to this day. Now again, you can look at the mainstream society that we have and the ongoing stated threat of nuclear annihilation. It certainly makes it a sensible prospect to have a developed survival complex underground. Yet you can find other more modern films and forms of fiction that'll tell you that no matter how far underground you go, there might not be any survival. I'll reference the more recent 2000s film Knowing, where no matter how far you went underground, it wasn't going to save you from that particular calamity. But interesting to consider, these subterranean compounds with their nuances and their details. Some are extensive subterranean compounds where you could fit tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people within. And yet others are smaller dwellings, almost giving the impression that there really was this desire, this effort to establish this. And I'm under the mindset that it went a lot further than simply trying to evade some Roman authorities that were chasing them on horseback at the time. There's even the more recent discoveries that were informed, and I haven't been to this site specifically, that we're given the impression that this is evidence of ancient human existence. And yet it fascinates me that we overlook one of the more basic observational details with this image, that we see what appears to be some sort of hive compound. And so, is this giving some credence to the theory that the ant people really did exist? That there was some sort of advanced life form that resembled an insect, or really was an advanced insect itself? Because one thing we don't know is, what are the possibilities of life? We think we understand it. We have the mainstream account that evolution takes a very long period of time. It's over millions of years that evolution occurs, to where a fish can go to a tube, to a monkey, to a human being. That's what will be informed from the mainstream. But yet we have a lot of other evidence that indicates that there can be sudden, abrupt changes. Is it possible that there was a technological capacity in the much nearer past than we'd like to think that had the ability to abruptly change the very form of life itself? What exactly is the dividing line between divine and technological capability? And does that line become a lot more blurred when we're trying to understand it over a period of time from accounts from the past? Why is it that there are so many overlapping mentalities with the traditions of whether it's the Hopi or any other group of societies or civilizations that seem to have a more advanced technological component that goes beyond simply divine being? And is it Arthur C. Clarke's statement that any sufficiently advanced civilization or technology would seem like magic to a less advanced civilization or technology? That seems to be the overlap that we have when we're trying to reconcile all these differences that we have. Now, of course, you can embrace the mainstream account and accept the belief that, yes, we've answered all the questions, yes, there are no mysteries, and that even trying to look at things from the perspective of mystery is a colossal waste of time. But I don't think you'd be here if you really thought any of that was true and that this is a waste of time, because why is there such an effort to try to convince us that it's a waste of time? It's a waste of time, then simply let us waste our time, and what difference does it make to you? In fact, the efforts to try to convince us that we are wasting our time are interesting to me. Because ultimately, should we not have the freedom to decide how to expend our own time? Well, no, there are many people out there who tell us and believe that they think they know what's best for us. And these people aren't part of institutions, they're not even part of governments or any other interests that we might traditionally associate with trying to control people. They're merely individuals who think they know what's best for whatever reason, and you'll find them in your midst all the time. But I strongly suggest that if you have the opportunity to really explore the nuances and the details of these different societies, these different cultures, look at them on their own, and then step far enough back and look at the commonalities that you see between them. And don't just allow things such as geographical separation or even quantum separation to make you believe that there are differences within these civilizations and these societies in the way that they viewed things. Because when you factor out distance and time, you suddenly find that there are a lot more similarities than we like to think. We suddenly realize that this may all be the same account, just simply told from different perspectives. That there really is one unified series of events that transpired in the past, and that it really is possible for us to gain a greater understanding of what truly happened. That it goes beyond the limitations of belief and the hard science that some other expert has to share with us. Now, that's not to discount that study. It's not to say that there aren't details in it. I mean, I myself even think that there is something behind the concept of the fourth dimensional structure of our entire spatial existence. But I don't believe that's the end-all be-all answer. I think that it's something even in greater grandeur than we could even begin to understand. It's certain to say that I don't think that we can perceive it with sight alone, that there might be a lot of other nuances behind it. But that's just my personal belief. You are certainly welcome to your personal beliefs, and by all means, share them. But why is it when we look at the terrain in different places, we do see something of a monument to the past? Now, whether we want to classify that monument as something that was created by natural forces or artificial forces, well, perhaps you could even say that that delineation is irrelevant in and of itself, because we do see the remains of the past everywhere that we look. And I think that's one of the closest things we can say to an incontrovertible fact that there is. And it's one of the reasons why I encourage you that if you have the ability and the access, that you explore structures that are nearby to your physical location. Explore your local government buildings that seem to defy the understood capability of the civilization that constructed them at the time. Explore mounds. Explore things that were informed were created by indigenous peoples of the distant past. Compare and contrast them. Don't limit your understanding by saying, well, that couldn't have been so because someone else told me it couldn't have been so. Really entertain the possibility for a moment. See the connections and see if you can really extrapolate from those connections an idea of how our true history is. I believe that is one of the most important legacies that we can have. And do these ant people still exist? Do the Anunnaki still exist? do the Tuatha Danann still exist? Or do their descendants still exist? I think of the example from the science fiction TV show Babylon 5 from the 1990s, where it posited the existence of different civilizations at different times. There were the old ones, the original species that came about first, and then the newer, younger races that followed them. And the main theme of Babylon 5 was how these old ones, or these original races, tried to influence the younger races. They tried to encourage and create a divine theocracy, in some cases, if you will. The Shadows or the Vorlons. And you can certainly do your own research and watch the TV series and see how these themes are presented. And it's a very unique presentation. Now, another interesting little fact is that the other science fiction series at the time, Star Trek, specifically Star Trek The Next Generation, had their own concept of a progenitor species, or an older race called the Preservers, if you will. And there was an episode called The Chase in Star Trek The Next Generation that posited this entire existence. Now, granted, Babylon 5 was more of an ensemble show that had overarching plot threads that went about through the entire season, whereas Star Trek was viewed as something that was standalone. But the idea and the theme is exactly the same, where you have these older races, these older beings, and we think of these older races or older beings as perhaps those that survived resets, and maybe even found a way to which they could exist far longer than the limited period of time that we have. Now, whatever the duration of that time frame is, whether it's hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of years, it's hard to say, because we really don't know what came in the past. Now, maybe you want to embrace the concept of having that confidence that you know exactly what the chronology of the past is, and I understand that there's a comfort in that. It's very difficult to see things as being ambiguous or ambivalent, to not have answers, because we are conditioned to seek answers and to know exactly what the solution to every problem is. We find it in our main forms of mental exercise every single day. And we live currently in a civilization that reinforces us, gives us positive reinforcement to find those answers. It's much more difficult to exist where there are mysteries, where there is ambiguity. When you see drawings like this and you admit to yourself, I don't exactly know what they represent. And yes, certainly you can listen to the Hopi oral traditions and you can realize and think that, yes, it was simply the elaborate imagination of people in the past who couldn't explain how they survived some terrifying event, and therefore they used their imaginations to explain it, and they recorded these drawings. And these cultural traditions endured over a period of time. And yes, that's completely possible. But it's also possible that these references to these incredible beings do have a lot more rooted in reality than we like to think. That this really is referring to a more advanced civilization. That whether these ant people, or whatever other name that we have for them in other cultures, whether they were benign or whether they had terrifying intent, that if they did exist, and if they do exist, then it is evidence, it is an indicator that it is possible to live on a much longer timeline. To not just have a singular lifestyle, but also to have a mentality where your existence, the existence of your civilization, will endure. To where you could achieve feats of, how shall we say, physical and spiritual transcendence. And if you do watch Babylon 5 to its conclusion, you'll see that that does seem to be the fate to any life form that exists on a long enough period of time. That it continues to grow. And maybe evolve isn't exactly the proper word. Perhaps something else happens. Maybe we achieve some sort of awareness that we're supposed to achieve. That instead of just achieving balance with our natural environment, we're actually able to achieve some sort of transcendence, some sort of transformation. And that's how we actually explain this concept that we have of our existence here. Perhaps that's the true purpose of life. That we're to face these trials and tribulations, and we're to gain this internal insight, this introspection. Because you'll find that virtually every mechanism that we have in our current civilization, right, wrong, or indifferent, it seems to function to keep us from engaging in this introspection, from looking within and trying to achieve this greater understanding. I think that's perhaps one of the greatest examples that we have of the possibility of the existence of the ant people. Now, were they saviors or were they tormentors? And if they do still exist, is it possible that they are influencing our current civilization? Because again, taking the example of the TV series Babylon 5, we found that these older races did have very, how shall we say, difficult means of influencing the younger races to do their bidding, to act in their own interest. And is that the reason why we have all these interesting cycles that we observe? Or is it some other explanation entirely? I do not know the answers, and I'm willing to admit and exist in an area where I don't know the answers. And if you're someone out there who wants to criticize someone for not knowing answers, then be my guest. If you already know everything, then what are you even doing here? Why are you even asking these questions? Well, I suppose only you can answer that. But what I'll leave you with on this very interesting and unique exploration is that you do have to seek your own answers. No one can do it for you, and maybe you find it easier to accept the answers that others have sought, and if you do, I'm happy for you, and I hope you find comfort and solace in doing that. But for others, there is something to be said for seeking your own answers, for constantly looking and constantly exploring all these unique mysteries that we have. I myself am both terrified and reassured that there are still many mysteries in our reality, that we have not yet explained everything. And I believe that is one of the fundamental functions of our existence here. And it doesn't really matter in that respect whether this is a reality, a simulation, or everything in between. We ultimately have to find our own answers, and maybe you believe that others have found those answers for you. Maybe you believe that the divine answers are found in Revelations, and maybe they are correct. Ultimately, I leave it to you. And I am open to all different forms and explanations, because I think only by considering all of them will we find the answers that we seek. But what are your thoughts? What do you think is the reality behind the ant people? Did they really exist? Are they simply the product of a legend? Are they divine beings? Are they actually humans that had some sort of advanced technology? Or are they something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
The presence of the others, non-human beings that we come across in our explorations. And what are these? We begin by looking at the Plague Doctor. Now, according to official history, the Plague Doctor was merely a response by the civilization, the societies of the so-called Middle Ages, to respond to the recurring occurrences of the bubonic plague, or the Black Death as they called it. The purpose behind the Plague Doctor was this was some individual who was not a fully trained doctor or was even considered a charlatan, who was contracted by the state to actually help people deal with the plague. Although, in reality, according to official historical accounts, they really didn't help anybody deal with anything. In fact, the only purpose they served with facilitating the government tracking the plague was designating who had actually contracted the plague and who had died from it. So again, another account of a previous government keeping track of who was alive and who was dead, and yet we still have questionable population counts. So, the Plague Doctor was not effective in responding to the plague. It should also be noted that the actual costume came a couple centuries after the original occurrence of the bubonic plague in the 1300s, or however you want to think of the official historical timeline. There's a very disturbing psychological effect with this character. And indeed, from official historical accounts at the time, we often have an almost inhuman appearance to it. And it's this recurring theme of the inhuman appearance that we have to question, is there something more behind this Plague Doctor? For example, we notice the details in the hands. Very inhuman hands that are often displayed with long nails or something that seems to be some sort of predatory creature. There's always the bird-like mask, and yet we can't ignore the fact that there's even a depiction from Native American lore that matches something that looks like the Plague Doctor. Is this merely a coincidence? Or is this also a profound psychological fear that endured in Native American mythology? To this day, we can see this individual that looks just like the Plague Doctor bird mask. Very strange and frightening creature. And yet when we look closely, we see that it's displayed with the same bizarre inhuman hands, with the long claws. So what are we really looking at with this Plague Doctor? Is this really just some human being who wore a bird mask to have pleasant-smelling things within the mask to protect them from the plague? At least that's what the mainstream tells us. It's always interesting how we have these conflicting accounts in terms of the capability of the denizens of a particular time period. And yet the Plague Doctor is no exception. Simply have pleasant-smelling things, and it'll protect you from the plague, the terrifying scourge of the bubonic death that had completely overwhelmed Europe and returned in subsequent centuries. Again, that's what the mainstream historical account says. But we consider the psychological and profound terror that would accompany this mask. Why would any government or religious authority at that time, as we're informed Europe especially had, allow this or condone it? It's almost as though they were trying to terrify their population if this is indeed what happened. Or was this really representing something else? A creature that was not human. A creature that may have once been human but was transformed. Or perhaps some sort of other creature. Certainly not human at all from its inception. And when we compare and contrast the accounts we have of the Plague Doctors from Europe to some of the accounts of the Native American mythology, these are questions we have to ask, because these consistencies are a little too common to simply be ignored and dismissed as mere coincidence. When you look closer at the Plague Doctor, though, you start to understand the psychological effect it has, imagining what may actually be under that mask. What if it's not human at all? What if you're actually looking at some sort of terrifying bird or predatory creature? Something that you could even say resembles a Skeksis from the Dark Crystal franchise. And indeed, you have other images that give the display of the pointed teeth and the predatory tongue that's often displayed from what creatures might actually be under these Plague Doctor masks. And we have a completely different consideration, a completely different series of events that may have transpired, that these masks, these almost chemical protective suits, were actually concealing a very horrific and terrifying creature underneath it, that for some reason the civilizations at that time continued to remember it, and always the profound psychological effect. Because we have to ask, if the Plague Doctor was not some sort of terrifying creature, why would the authorities at the time actually have their doctors dress up with such a mentality to terrify the population? Unless in reality they were these creatures, and they were simply concealing themselves so they could operate within the population, to do whatever terrifying thing that they were going to do. And we have a good idea of what that was, because what persists with the rumors of these Plague Doctors or these terrifying creatures is they were indeed predatory. The population in its collective conscience remembers that death accompanied these creatures wherever they showed up. And it was not merely a coincidence. It's something that was remembered and recorded, and you can find no shortage of examples, not just in European historical accounts, but also in the mythologies of many Native American tribes at how terrifying and horrific these creatures really were. What sort of powers did they have? And why is it that they still endure in our memory to this day? The terrifying implications of seeing the appearance of whatever creature may have really existed under the costume of the Plague Doctor. And now we go to the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter. Oftentimes the whole aspect of aliens is dismissed as being absurd and ludicrous, and yet we have this account of the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins, not necessarily aliens, and this occurred in the town of Kelly, near Hopkinsville in Kentucky, not very far from Fort Campbell in Tennessee, a major U.S. Army base where the 101st Airborne Division is based. And in the encounter at the isolated Sutton farmhouse, we have an account of these terrifying little goblins that just showed up on this farmhouse. What's a little bit more interesting, though, about this account compared to the usual so-called alien contact accounts is that there seem to be elements of it that are more real. For example, there's no accounts of any missing time. We merely had this unfortunate family in this isolated farm in Kentucky that suddenly encountered these goblins, these creatures that were prowling about their farm. And this, of course, invokes the terror with this account. It should also be noted that local authorities, which did include members of the 101st Airborne Division, did arrive to respond to this incident after this family was terrified through a night by these goblins and tried to fend them off by using firearms. Naturally, the firearms were not effective against these horrific entities, these goblins, or these aliens, whatever you really want to think of them as. And yet the incident afterwards was well documented of the family being terrorized in their own house by these horrific goblins. Repeated attempts to fend them off with firearms were ineffective, and the goblins continued to terrorize the family within and in the exterior of their house and their farm. It should be noted that when the authorities arrived on the scene, they took this account very seriously, and they did notice that the family seemed to be in a state of utter terror and panic, as though they really had endured some sort of event that had challenged their psychological well-being. And one could certainly understand why the presence of ghoulish creatures that are impervious to firearms could inflict such terror on people that they would never forget it. And I think that's one of the elements of this particular account that gives it a little bit more credibility. Of course, we could easily dismiss this account as the product of fantastical imaginations, but the fact that the authorities did respond and did document that this family was psychologically traumatized gives it a little more credibility. It should also be noted that this encounter very nearly inspired a certain filmmaker to make a film about terrifying aliens. Of course, he changed it to more of a cute alien that we recall as E.T. The event was also documented in local media at the time. On this farm in Kelly, Kentucky, where the story of a spaceship and 12 little men showed up on the farm terrorizing the family, and that the firearms were indeed ineffective defending them off. What was really going on? What were these creatures? Were these aliens, as we might like to think, or were these some other extraterrestrial entities beyond which we understand? Or was this some sort of cryptid, some sort of undocumented animal that happened to be existing near this farm? Or was it simply the product of mass hallucination and everyone panicking had caused the family to go into this panic state because they thought they viewed something that was not really there? And when the authorities arrived, therefore they documented it as though it was an event where the family was psychologically traumatized, but it was merely the product of their own crazed imaginations. It should be noted, though, that there is a very profound psychological effect to intrusions within your own property, your own residence. So we could certainly understand why the profound psychological effect could inspire the imagination to hallucinate a little bit. But for whatever reason, there seems to be some more consistencies behind this. Although some would state that it's merely a desire of the state of Kentucky to simply bring about more tourism by pushing this particular area and having people come in to explore the lands that were involved in the great Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter. Yet, oddly enough, in subsequent events and investigations, there never seemed to be many inconsistencies with the accounts that were given, and no one in the family ever retracted their account as being official. Now, I'm sure if you look a little deeper, you might find potential retractions and changes, or the story going back and forth. But it is a very terrifying and almost realistic seeming story. What were these goblins if they did in fact exist? Where did they come from? And what was their true intention? Based on the events that the family reported, they just seemed to be curious above all else. And it really was stating the word probing. Probing is a military procedure, or conducting reconnaissance, trying to learn about a particular area. And there might be a follow-on force that's going to follow probing. These are some of the sketches of the creatures, or the goblins, or the entities, or whatever you want to refer to them as, that were cataloged by one of the members of the 101st Airborne when they showed up to investigate this event. Some local authorities even suggested that
perhaps the family had misidentified our good friend the owl as these horrific entities. Yes, indeed, and I've certainly encountered a lot of bulletproof owls in my life as well. They're beautiful animals, but somehow I don't believe that these were owls. Either this was some sort of massive psychological aberration for the family, or there was a little bit more to this account. There is a troubling and unsettling element of realism. The fact that this remains a quote-unquote well-documented account, and the fact that no one was ever able to dismiss or disprove this. The actual occurrence of creatures showing up in our home or our isolated residence is a recurring terror that we face. So, do these creatures represent something that are real? Do they have some other explanation? Let's look at the accounts that we have of cryptids, monsters, and demons. One of the most well-known that we have tends to be the Jersey Devil, operating in the Pine Barrens Forest in New Jersey. And there have been many different films and books that explore the account of the legend of the birth of this creature, involving elements of witchcraft and myth and several different origin stories, although there tend to be a few agreed upon. The Jersey Devil represents the classic cryptid, a very disgusting and horrific creature that exists in contravention of all known rules of life. And yet there have been several documented sightings of this creature, some images even being purported to be real. Although, of course, we know that with our ability to generate images, this doesn't necessarily prove anything. And again, this could be another example of some sort of psychological aberration. But what interests me is that we have so many different historical accounts, or things that are well documented, that allude to the existence of this terrifying creature, this Jersey Devil. There's also the really strange element of the psychological effects that seem to accompany this creature wherever it exists, or if it does in fact exist. Is this merely the product of the tales impacting the human mind, and suddenly it becomes yet another version of mass hysteria? Well, perhaps the thing we should be most concerned about then is how easily influenced the human mind can be, and perhaps how easily influenced the mind can be in large groups, if that's indeed what we're seeing here as the mainstream wants us to believe, that none of these creatures really exist, and that people are just simply susceptible to, how shall we say, suggestion. But oddly enough, there do seem to be more details behind certain cryptids and creatures such as the Jersey Devil, whether it's the description of its actual being, or some of its terrifying personal habits that it has. What does it hunt? And why does it have such an element of terror to it? Is it possible that such a creature could really exist? We've oftentimes dismissed the other creatures that we said could never exist, and yet we're often surprised at what our mainstream and official accounts tell us about what existed in the distant past, whether it's large creatures or terrifying creatures. This is what the Jersey Devil allegedly looks like, and this is its scale to an actual human. Now, is it true to some of the mythological accounts that the Jersey Devil was the product of some sort of witchcraft, some sort of spell, or maybe even some sort of dark alchemy, if you will? Some sort of experiment that we think about with the homunculus example, that may have gone wrong and transformed either some sort of unfortunate creature or human being into something else. Once again, this will simply be dismissed as fantastical accounts, or simply searching for possibilities when there are none. It should also be noted that one of the most interesting films made about the Jersey Devil was Exploring for the Jersey Devil, called The Last Broadcast. It set the stage for the found footage films, although this one is a little unique, and it did precede the more famous and well-known Blair Witch film. The other interesting element about this film is it talks about the profound psychological impact on certain individuals. And unlike the Blair Witch, we do actually find out who's behind the killings in this film. And we do find out where the real terror lies. It's within the human heart, or the human soul, or however you want to view it. And perhaps that's the real terror that we have. Other cryptids that we consider are the Mothman from West Virginia. And the Mothman has several different accounts behind it that seem to give it a little bit more realism than we might like to think. Accounts of something being in post-World War II munitions plants, a creature that was roving around there that terrorized several teens as they were driving in their car.
There's even an account of a couple teens trying to escape this creature, driving at speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour, and the creature was easily keeping up as it flew. There's also the accounts of the Mothman that say that it would be a portent of doom. Of course, there's always signs and portents that seems to accompany these creatures, whether it's a bridge collapse or some other great calamity that occurs in a particular area. There's many myths that actually come about from Appalachia where this Mothman was sighted, and many of these myths include other accounts of cryptids. Is there again something more to this, or once again is this a mass psychological aberration? Is this again some sort of creature that may have existed in the distant past, and yet some surviving examples of it, for whatever reason, continue to inhabit the wilderness that are not easily seen? Or again, is it just something that we could easily dismiss as some sort of psychological aberration? Our mainstream adherents will dismiss this as merely the product of pseudoscience, and indeed they try to categorize these sightings as the adherents of pseudoscience simply trying to push a meaning that these are aliens or some other strange cryptid creatures that have never been seen. What I find particularly interesting, though, is in this age of the internet and shared information, that we have such a variety of creatures that are seen all over the land. We don't have people reporting Mothman sightings all over every single continent. We have unique creatures that seem to be confined to unique regions. Now, once again, I'm sure that our mainstream skeptics or skeptoids will tell us that this is merely the product of localized mass hysteria. We also consider the account of the Wendigo, a Native American mythological terror. The Wendigo is quite fascinating because of the fact that it was a spirit, and yet there are diverging accounts that it was either some sort of horrific, monstrous creature or a spirit that would possess a human being, causing it to engage in cannibalistic tendencies. Indeed, the terror behind these creatures is that they would actually feed exclusively on human flesh. And I've always given a little bit more variety and understanding, along with authenticity, to some of the Native American mythological accounts. They had to go through surviving a lot of factors of the reset to include the reservation in the American education system, and yet they managed to retain many of their myths and their legends, which do seem to have a little bit more in terms of legitimacy to them, especially given the fact that there are numerous Native Americans that will not speak of creatures such as these. The Wendigo is terrifying, though, because of its existential nature of threatening the very flesh of human beings. There's also accounts of the fact that it did persist across the land, and it's such a very powerful memory. And again, it goes back to questioning the whole fact that we have such a vast array and variety of creatures that are seen across the land. So, again, is this merely the product of old myth, old legend that's very regionalized and localized, and we don't see it everywhere? Or is there something that's truly authentic to the presence or the possible presence of these creatures that are very clearly non-human, or perhaps an even more disturbing possibility that these creatures were once human that were transformed into something that were no longer human by some process that we no longer understand? Indeed, when we look at many of the mythological accounts, the legend, whether we're talking about one of the cryptids, the Wendigo, or even the Plague Doctor, there seem to be accounts that do give a disturbing possibility of what these creatures could possibly afflict in terms of terror on a human population. And this is where we start to see the connections from our other previous explorations when we look at the fall of previous civilizations. We do seem to have it in our collective memory that there were creatures that were quite terrifying, creatures that had tremendous psychological, physical, and even spiritual capabilities to attack and destroy the very welfare, the very fabric of human civilizations in the past. Imagine a vast army or array of such creatures like this, different types of creatures in different areas that had these extended capabilities. Now, once again, I'm sure the adherents of the mainstream would dismiss such a notion as the product of pseudoscience or just simply a wild imagination. Although, I'm always interested in the fact that we also want to say that there were wondrous and fantastical creatures that did officially exist in the distant past. So why is it some creatures could exist and other creatures cannot? Well, you simply need to turn to someone in authority, someone who has been through the academic system, and they will give you an honest answer. And the last thing you should ever do is trust what you see with your own eyes, or certainly do not come to your own conclusions. But when we look at the mythological terrors that many of these creatures represent, and we see the fact that they endure within our fear in the back of our mind to this day, we can see that there is indeed a lingering and profound psychological effect behind them. And whatever the actual story behind these creatures, if they're simply truly the product of our minds, or do they represent something that did exist and did terrorize us in the past? We also have to ask the question in terms of how long ago this was in the past. It should be noted that the Native Americans do not speak of many of the terrifying elements of their mythology. And whether it's a skinwalker, a wendigo, or whatever, and there's certainly no shortage of different creatures that appear in Native American mythology that are quite threatening and terrifying, we do have to remember there does seem to be an element of realism to them, in the fact of the impact of the psychological terror that people do not speak of them. Are these creatures simply the product of our nightmares and we simply record them to terrorize others for entertainment purposes? Or is there something behind them that does reflect something that genuinely happened in the past? A memory, if you will, that's locked in our minds. Were these just UFOs or lights, or do they represent something else? We do have many accounts of strange anomalies that do not make a lot of sense, and oftentimes people will go to extreme levels to dismiss anything which is seen and reported. And it's quite fascinating. Yet the same accounts could be used or subverted for misinformation purposes. So we always have to remain cautious and keep open minds and actually come to our own conclusions. We see that there is definitely a theme to make the whole concept of exploring topics such as this ridiculous and absurd. And certain skeptoids and people will tell us that we shouldn't even be considering this. Yet when we go about the land, we do see very interesting remnants of what may have been in the past. We do see odd objects that defy simple explanation. And we do have accounts, even when we look at our official and certified historical account, that simply do not make a lot of sense. So what's the real explanation behind these others, these non-human beings? What were they, and where did they fall in our 5 eras possible timeline? Perhaps the plague doctors really were some sort of terrifying creature that was contrived or created in the distant past using some sort of dark alchemical processes. These were creatures that existed between the resets, and they were unleashed on the population to bring about control. And that's why we still have this mentality of death that accompanies the plague doctors. The cryptids could have been other creatures from even before in the past. A few surviving examples that are still dotted across the land. Of course, it could simply be the product of our imagination, and for some reason these legends endure and people are just simply into entertainment. So simply watch the news and don't question anything, and allow yourself to be told what to think and what's important every day. You certainly have that option. But the plague doctor is something that intrigues me because we're informed that this was a response to the plague at the time. Yet these were the same people who managed to construct the Florence Cathedral. And it should be noted that the Florence Cathedral in Florence, Italy was constructed prior to the Renaissance, and they didn't need an industrial revolution to do it. Of course, we can simply wave it off with our usual intellectual cheetah flips of explaining what happened in the past. But what do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me.